Greetings everyone. A few guide points about our video today. We'll look into the history of these two nations, following which we will have a run through of the current crisis and the reasons for it becoming what it is. And finally, we will come around to India and why we as Indians should be concerned about this tussle, what some are calling the unofficial next world war.
Let us take a small brief into history that took place between Russia and Ukraine that may help us formulate the reasons of the war. Ukraine became an independent state in 1991 with the disintegration of the Soviet Union. In 2015, Ukraine suspended military cooperation agreement with Russia that was in place since 1993. In 2018, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law defining areas seized by the People's Republic as temporarily occupied by Russia. Russia's state-owned energy company Gazprom and Ukraine agreed a 5-year deal on Russian gas transit to Europe at the end of 2019. In late March 2021, it was reported that large movements of military equipment were occurring in various areas within Russia. These tensions also come in line with the election of Zelensky, who has pushed back against the Russian encroachment on Ukrainian sovereignty and showed increasing intent to join NATO. On 21st February 2022, Russia officially recognized the People's Republic LPR and DPR as two Ukrainian breakaway states. On the same day, Putin ordered deployment of troops to territory held by LPR and DPR. After Russia started an invasion on Ukraine on 24th of February, Zelensky announced that Ukraine cut all diplomatic relations with its eastern neighbor.
Now, after looking into the history, we may have formed our opinions of either sides. But let's look into a small breakthrough and answer the big question, which is why the war? In July 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin wrote and published an article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, which can still be found on the Russian president's website, wherein Putin states, Russians and Ukrainians were one people, a single whole. By this point in time, two major reasons for this invasion can be noted. Number one, pro-NATO president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, who's showing clear intent of joining NATO and the EU. Knowing this, it should not come as a surprise that Russia would never want this, as it is like having your enemy as your neighbor. Number two, there is also historical significance to the current situation. Ukraine was once part of the Soviet Union, and Putin, being a Soviet spy in his youth, has a certain sentiment attached towards the oneness of the Soviet Union, which is shared by many Russians who were born in the same era. Putin would also not want his legacy to be a Russian president, during whose time Ukraine went to the west and Russian red line was crossed. Now, moving on to a bigger question, why now? Even though Ukraine had been in pro-NATO talks for several years, this is the first time a president has been so visibly against Russia and has even attacked many pro-Russian businessmen and politicians during his tenure. The escalation and build-up of forces, increasingly frustrated with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who came to power in 2019 having campaigned on promises of peace but refused to implement the Minsk agreement on Russia's terms. Moscow deployed near Ukraine's border what looked like the beginning of an invasion force. The second build-up began in the late autumn of 2021. As more Russian troops entered the separatist-held areas, Ukraine on 23rd of February declared a state of emergency, called up its reservists, and passed a law allowing its citizens to carry firearms and use them in self-defense. That evening, President Zelensky reported that his efforts to reach Putin had been in vain. Speaking Russian on his Telegram channel, he addressed the Russian people in a heartfelt plea to prevent war. Referring to Moscow's propaganda, Zelensky went on to ask how he, the grandson of a man who served out World War II in the Soviet infantry and died in independent Ukraine, could be a Nazi. As Russians started, Kyiv officially broke diplomatic ties with Moscow. Observing the boots on the ground. Tens of thousands of people have already crossed into 5 countries bordering western Ukraine. Poland alone has reported around 5,000 arrivals within 2 days, while thousands more have streamed further into Moldova, Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia. Many of those fleeing the invasion are women and children, as all men aged 18 to 60 are being told to stay and fight. Let's look at the NATO aspect. NATO leaders say that they have been deploying more troops to Eastern Europe after Russia's invasion. President Putin's decision to attack Ukraine is a terrible strategic mistake for which Russia will pay a price, both economically and politically, for years to come, the statement says. This crisis affects us all. Sanctions on Russia by the rest of the world. The United States. In the statement, the White House said this includes Russia-wide restrictions on semiconductors, telecommunication, encryption security, lasers, sensors, navigation, avionics, and maritime technologies. Washington also applied sanctions on Russian banks, and whom it described as corrupt billionaires and their families who are close to Kremlin. It said that it would cut off 13 major state-owned companies from raising money in the United States, including the energy giant Gazprom. The United Kingdom. An asset freeze will be imposed on Russian state bank VTB, he added, following the sanctioning of 5 Russian banks on Tuesday. Russian state and private companies will also be prevented from fundraising in the United Kingdom. Australia. Australia's leader said Friday that it would begin imposing further sanctions on oligarchs and whose economic weight on strategic significance in Moscow and over 300 members of the Russian Duma, their parliament. Japan. The range of measures includes freezing the assets of certain Russian individuals and financial institutions while also banning exports to Russian military organizations.
Now that we've seen a brief bulletin of arousing issues, let's now take a look at how we are concerned. The Russia-Ukraine crisis, implications on India. Number 1, impact on India's policy towards the West. An invasion by Russia and a break with the United States and its allies would put pressure on India to choose between the Western alliance and Russia. Impact on defense ties with Russia. It is possible that India will face fines as a result of the S-400 acquisition. There might be a push for India to sever all defense relations with Russia. Number 3, national interest with Russia. Because it lacks leverage offered by permanent membership in the UN Security Council to preserve its national interests. Number 4, benefits in the INST project, which is the International North-South Transportation Project. And finally, number 5, slow pace of relationship with China. Thank you for joining us in the depiction of the current Russia-Ukraine crisis. Let us all hope for a more peaceful and diplomatic ending to this war and pray for all those whose lives are at risk.